A perfectly intact merchant vessel drifted aimlessly across the rolling swells of the North Atlantic, carrying a cargo worth a small fortune, yet not a single human soul remained on board. It was early afternoon on December 5, 1872, when the crew of the British brigantine Dei Gratia spotted the strange, erratic silhouette on the horizon, roughly 400 miles east of the Azores. The ship was listing slightly, yawing unpredictably, and steering a course that defied all logic. Sensing that a fellow maritime crew was in dire distress, Captain David Morehouse ordered his vessel to close the distance. He watched through his spyglass, hailing the silent ship repeatedly, but receiving only the hollow sound of wind and creaking wood in return. Recognizing the vessel as the Mary Celeste, a ship that had departed New York a week before his own, Morehouse dispatched a small boarding party, led by his first mate, Oliver DeVoe. When the men climbed over the damp wooden rails, they entered a silent, ghost-like world. They found a ship that was entirely seaworthy, with ample provisions of food and water, designed to last for 6 months. Yet the captain, his family, and his entire crew had vanished without a trace, leaving behind an empty vessel and a mystery that would baffle scientists, historians, and sailors for generations to come. In the decades that followed, this silent derelict would become the foundation of countless legends, warped by exaggeration and myth. Popular folklore fueled by Victorian sensationalism, and a famous fictional story penned by a young Arthur Conan Doyle would claim that the boarding party found warm cups of tea still steaming on the table, half-eaten meals left on plates, and a sewing machine with a child's garment half-stitched. The cold reality, documented in the official maritime court records, was far less romantic, but infinitely more terrifying. There were no half-eaten meals, no warm cups of tea, and no signs of a sudden supernatural interruption. Instead, the boarding crew stepped into a scene of chaotic abandonment. The ship's decks were wet, several sails were torn or missing, and a foot of water sloshed in the galley. Below deck, the personal belongings of the crew were neatly stored in their chests, and the captain's cabin still held a small toy piano and a sewing machine, dry and untouched. But the ship's only lifeboat, a small yawl normally lashed above the main hatch, was gone. The navigation instruments, including the sextant and the chronometer, were missing, as was the ship's register. On the cabin table lay the log slate, showing a final, unremarkable entry written at 8 o'clock on the morning of November 25th, 10 days prior. For 10 days, this robust, 282-ton brigantine had been sailing herself across hundreds of open, turbulent ocean, piloted only by the winds and the currents, carrying the ghosts of a family and a crew whose fates remained sealed by the sea. To understand how a highly experienced captain could make the unthinkable decision to abandon a fully functional ship in the middle of the Atlantic, one must look back to the origins of the vessel itself and the people who staked their lives on her. The Mary Celeste was not born under a lucky star. Built in Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia in 1861, she was originally launched under British registration as the Amazon. From her very first voyage, tragedy and misfortune clung to her wooden hull. Her first captain fell mysteriously ill and died of pneumonia just days after taking command, and her maiden voyage was plagued by minor collisions and structural mishaps. A few years later, she ran heavily aground in Nova Scotia during a fierce storm, suffering damage so severe that her owners abandoned her to salvage. Rebuilt, restored, and eventually sold to American owners, she was rechristened the Mary Celeste in 1869. The ship was structurally transformed, gaining a second deck and an increased carrying capacity, turning her into a sturdy, deep-hulled merchant brigantine. This hybrid rig, square-rigged sails on her foremast and fore and aft sails on her mainmast, offered a balance of speed and maneuverability, but it also required a highly skilled crew to manage the complex interplay of lines and canvases in heavy weather. By 1872, the ship had been purchased by a consortium of investors, chief among them being Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs. At 37 years old, Briggs was the epitome of a New England mariner, deeply religious, highly disciplined, and possessing an unblemished career on the high seas. He was a man who commanded respect from peers and sailors alike. This voyage was meant to be both a commercial venture and a family journey. Joining him on the voyage was his wife, Sarah, a cultured woman who brought her sewing machine and her books to ease the isolation of the sea, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. The couple's 7-year-old son, Arthur, was left behind in Massachusetts with his grandmother so he could continue his schooling, a heartbreaking but ultimately merciful decision that spared him from the dark fate of his family. To man the ship, Briggs hand-selected a crew of 7. They were not the desperate, rowdy sailors often associated with 19th-century merchant ports, but quiet, professional men of German and Danish origin, chosen for their experience and reliable character. Among them was the first mate, Albert Richardson, a seasoned officer who had sailed under Briggs's family before and was trusted implicitly.
The mission of this newly assembled crew was to transport a highly lucrative yet incredibly hazardous cargo across the North Atlantic to the Italian port of Genoa. Stored deep within the dark hold of the Mary Celeste were 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, shipped by Meissner Ackermann & Company. This cargo was not meant for human consumption, but was destined to be used in the fortification of Italian wines. Unlike consumable spirits, this raw, high-proof denatured alcohol was highly volatile and chemical in nature. Its physical properties meant that it was exceptionally sensitive to changes in temperature and humidity, prone to expansion, and capable of generating highly toxic explosive vapors if the barrels leaked. The barrels themselves were constructed of 2 distinct types of wood. The majority were made of sturdy, impermeable white oak, but a small portion of the shipment was cased in red oak, a much more porous timber that was far more susceptible to sweating and leaking. On November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste unfurled her sails and glided out of New York Harbor, navigating past the bustling docks and heading out into the open ocean. The early stages of the voyage were marked by the typical hardships of a late autumn crossing. Sailing across the Atlantic in November is an exercise of endurance. It requires a constant active engagement with the elements, navigating the violent seasonal storms that sweep down from Canada and clash with the warm, humid air of the Gulf Stream. The ocean currents in this region are powerful and unpredictable, capable of pulling a ship off course by dozens of miles in a single day if the captain cannot regularly calculate its position. For 2 weeks, the ship battled through heavy gales, the wooden timbers groaning under the immense pressure of the waves, while the crew worked tirelessly to adjust the sails, secure the rigging, and pump out the water that inevitably seeped into the bilge. The physical science of 19th-century navigation was a meticulous, demanding process. Without modern satellite arrays or radio communication, a captain's survival depended entirely on 3 instruments: the compass, the sextant, and the marine chronometer. The magnetic compass, mounted in a wooden binnacle near the steering wheel, allowed the helmsman to maintain a consistent heading, though it was always vulnerable to local magnetic interference from iron fittings on the ship. The sextant allowed Captain Briggs to calculate the angle between the horizon and celestial bodies, such as the sun or stars, to determine the ship's latitude. The marine chronometer, a highly precise clock designed to keep perfect time despite the constant motion of the ship, was used to calculate longitude. To find his exact position on the vast, featureless ocean, Briggs had to combine these celestial observations with dead reckoning, estimating his current position based on the ship's previously determined position, speed, and heading. This required regular, uninterrupted calculations, which were recorded on a slate and later transcribed into the ship's official logbook. As the Mary Celeste neared the Azores, an archipelago rising from the mid-Atlantic ridge,
The weather worsened dramatically. The region is known for its volatile atmospheric conditions, where sudden shifts in barometric pressure can conjure violent localized storms and towering waterspouts. For days, the ship was battered by relentless winds and heavy seas, forcing the family and the crew to remain confined to their damp, claustrophobic quarters below deck. The psychological pressure of this environment was immense. Human psychology under prolonged stress, surrounded by the deafening roar of a storm and the terrifying realization that only a few inches of wood separate you from a cold, watery grave, can cloud the judgment of even the most seasoned mariner. On the morning of November 25th, the storm had finally begun to abate, but the sea remained rough and chaotic. Captain Briggs made his final entry on the log slate, noting that they were passing just north of Santa Maria Island. It was a standard, calm piece of record-keeping, suggesting that whatever happened next occurred with terrifying suddenness, leaving no time for explanation. 10 days later, when the boarding party from the Dei Gratia stepped onto the abandoned ship, they immediately looked for clues to explain this sudden flight. Oliver DeVoe noted that one of the ship's 2 bilge pumps had been completely disassembled, its rod lying on the deck nearby. The bilge pump was the lifeblood of a wooden ship, used to clear the water that naturally accumulated in the lowest part of the hull. If a pump was non-functional, the crew faced the terrifying prospect of a slowly sinking vessel. DeVoe also measured the water level in the hold and found 3.5 feet of water. While this seemed like a significant volume, it was actually a manageable amount for a vessel of the Mary Celeste's size and construction, far from anything to threaten her buoyancy. However, modern forensic analysis suggests a critical detail. The passage of coal dust and debris from a previous cargo of coal may have clogged the pump's internal valves, rendering it useless. Furthermore, because the ship's hold was tightly packed with 1,701 barrels of alcohol, Briggs would have been unable to physically peer down into the depths of the hold to verify the true water level. He had to rely on a sounding rod, a tool lowered down a narrow pipe to measure the bilge water. If that pipe was clogged, or if the sounding rod gave an inaccurate reading due to the rolling of the ship, Briggs might have mistakenly believed his ship was filling with water at a catastrophic rate, panicking him into believing they only had minutes to escape. When the Dei Gratia successfully brought the Mary Celeste into the British port of Gibraltar, the maritime mystery quickly transformed into a high-stakes legal drama. Under international maritime law, the crew of the Dei Gratia was entitled to a substantial salvage award, a financial payout based on the value of the recovered vessel and its cargo. However, this sparked deep suspicion within the British Vice Admiralty Court, presided over by the zealous and conspiratorial Attorney General Frederick Solly Flood. Solly Flood found it impossible to believe that a crew would willingly abandon a perfectly seaworthy ship. He suspected a dark, violent conspiracy, launching a rigorous investigation aimed at proving that foul play had occurred on the high seas.
The court examined several sensational theories, the first of which was mutiny. Solly Flood hypothesized that the crew had broken into the cargo, consumed the industrial alcohol, and in a drunken, violent frenzy, murdered Captain Briggs, his wife, and their young child before fleeing the ship in the lifeboat. To support this theory, the court pointed to several marks on the ship's bow, which Solly Flood claimed were made by an axe, and a rusty ceremonial sword found under the captain's bed, which bore dark, reddish stains. However, scientific analysis quickly dismantled this narrative. The raw industrial alcohol in the hold was entirely undrinkable. Consuming it would have caused immediate blindness, severe poisoning, or death, rather than a drunken revelry. Furthermore, chemical testing of the reddish stains on the sword and the deck rails proved they were not blood, but rather a combination of iron rust and spilled lemon juice. There were no signs of a struggle in the cabins, no signs of defensive wounds, and no evidence that any of the crew's personal belongings had been stolen. Solly Flood then turned his suspicions toward the salvagers themselves, accusing Captain Morehouse and the crew of the Dei Gratia of piracy. He proposed that the two ships had met in the Atlantic and that Morehouse's crew had boarded the Mary Celeste
slaughtered everyone on board, and fabricated the entire story of finding her abandoned in order to claim the massive salvage payout. This theory, while dramatically appealing to the public, lacked any logical or physical support. Briggs and Morehouse were not strangers. They were respected colleagues who had dined together in New York just nights before their respective departures. Morehouse's ship was carrying a valuable cargo of petroleum and had its own strict schedule to maintain. To commit mass murder in the middle of a heavily trafficked shipping lane with a child on board for the mere hope of a salvage reward that would be heavily scrutinized by a maritime court was a risk no rational captain would take. Ultimately, the court found no evidence of piracy or collusion, and while the crew of the Dei Gratia was eventually awarded a salvage payout, it was only a fraction of the ship's actual value, reflecting the court's lingering, unproven suspicions. Another theory that circulated widely was that of insurance fraud. Skeptics suggested that Captain Briggs, perhaps facing financial ruin, had conspired with the ship's owners to abandon the vessel and claim the insurance money. Yet this theory falls apart under close examination of the financial and personal realities. Briggs was a deeply moral man of comfortable financial means, and he had invested a significant portion of his own savings into purchasing a share of the Mary Celeste. More importantly, he had brought his beloved wife and his toddler daughter on the voyage. No father, let alone a highly experienced and cautious mariner, would deliberately cast his young family adrift in a fragile, open lifeboat in the dangerous waters of the winter Atlantic to pull off a financial scam. The risk to their lives was absolute, while the potential financial gain was modest at best.
As the sensational theories of violence, fraud, and mutiny crumbled under the weight of logical inquiry, scientists and maritime experts began to search for physical, natural explanations. One prominent theory was the waterspout. A waterspout is essentially a tornado that forms over water, capable of generating wind speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour and creating intense, localized drops in barometric pressure. If a waterspout had passed directly over or near the Mary Celeste, the rapid change in atmospheric pressure could have forced water up through the ship's sounding pipes, making the bilge appear full and convincing the captain that the hull was breaching. The sheer, terrifying noise and visual specter of a towering column of water spinning toward the ship would have been enough to induce sheer panic, prompting Briggs to order his family and crew into the yawl to wait out the danger. Yet, a waterspout would likely have caused severe visible damage to the ship's rigging and masts, none of which was observed by the boarding crew of the Dei Gratia, who noted only minor wear on the sails. This leads to the most scientifically plausible and compelling explanation, one that bridges the gap between chemistry, physics, and human psychology: the alcohol vapor explosion theory. For over a century, researchers struggled to explain how the ship's volatile cargo of 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol could have caused the crew to flee without leaving behind any physical evidence of fire or soot. The breakthrough came in 2006 when Dr. Andrea Sella, an inorganic chemist at University College London, conducted a series of sophisticated laboratory experiments to test the mechanics of vaporous blasts in confined spaces. Using a custom-built scale replica of the Mary Celeste's cargo hold, Dr. Sella simulated the conditions of the fateful voyage. He introduced butane gas to replicate the highly volatile ethanol vapors that would have leaked from the 9 porous red oak barrels during the journey. When he introduced a spark, simulating the friction of shifting barrels, a spark from an iron hoop, or a crewman lighting a pipe near the hatch, the results were startling. A dramatic, sudden explosion tore through the replica hold, sending a spectacular wave of flame upward. Yet when the flames subsided, the objects inside the hold were completely undamaged. There was no soot, no scorch marks, and no burning of the delicate paper models used in the experiment.
Dr. Sella explained that this was a classic pressure wave or cool flame explosion.
Because the fuel-to-air ratio of the leaking alcohol vapor was highly localized, the resulting blast was a rapid, high-velocity flame front that consumed the gas instantly, but did not last long enough to ignite the heavy wooden timbers or the barrels themselves. To the crew on deck, however, this experience would have been nothing short of cataclysmic. They would have heard a deafening, thunderous roar rumble from the depths of the ship. The immense pressure wave would have violently blown open the heavy wooden hatch covers, venting a terrifying, invisible flash of heat and a foul-smelling, toxic cloud of chemical fumes into the air. To Captain Briggs, standing on the deck with his wife and child, this would have felt like the end. He was standing directly above a floating bomb filled with over 1,700 barrels of highly explosive chemical fuel. Believing that a second devastating explosion was imminent and that the ship was about to blow herself apart, Briggs would have had to make a split-second decision to save his family. He would have shouted the order to abandon ship, not with the intention of permanently deserting the Mary Celeste, but to seek temporary safety away from the hull until the danger had passed. In their frantic haste, the 10 people scrambled into the small yawl. To ensure they did not get separated from their ship, they grabbed the main peak halyard, a long, heavy rope used to secure the sails, and tied one end to the Mary Celeste and the other to the lifeboat. They drifted behind the brigantine, floating in the choppy waters of the Atlantic, watching the silent, majestic vessel and waiting for the fumes to clear or the fire to burn out. But the ocean is a place of brutal, unyielding physics. The weight of the heavily loaded yawl, combined with the powerful ocean currents and the sudden dragging resistance of the water, would have put immense, unimaginable tension on the makeshift tow line. As they drifted, a sudden squall or a shift in the wind would have caught the Mary Celeste's remaining sails. The ship, designed to harness the power of the wind, would have surged forward with immense force. Under the sudden violent strain, the peak halyard would have snapped like a sound of a gunshot. In an instant, the bond between the two vessels was severed. The empty Mary Celeste, light and perfectly trimmed for the wind, would have glided away into the gray mist, moving faster than 10 people could ever row. The tragedy of what happened next is written in the silent, indifferent expanse of the open ocean. Left behind in a tiny, open, overloaded lifeboat, 400 miles from the nearest land, the family and the crew would have watched their only home, their only source of shelter and warmth, slowly shrink into a speck on the horizon before disappearing entirely. They were left with no navigation instruments, no shelter from the biting cold of the winter Atlantic, and no hope of rescue. As the night fell and the temperatures dropped, they would have battled the rising waves, their physical strength slowly failing them as hypothermia took hold. Within days, if not hours, the sea would have claimed them and the lifeboat, its passengers, into the cold, silent depths, leaving no wreckage, no flotation devices, and no bodies to ever be found. When the Dei Gratia eventually spotted the Mary Celeste 10 days later, the ship had sailed herself through storms and shifting winds, a testament to her robust construction and the skill with which her sails had been set before the evacuation. She was a silent monument to a moment of sheer, scientifically understandable panic. The ship itself would survive the ordeal, but she would never shake the dark, cursed reputation that clung to her name. Over the next decade, she passed through the hands of a dozen different owners, each suffering financial losses, mysterious accidents, or structural failures, until her final captain deliberately ran her aground off the coast of Haiti in 1885 in a clumsy, failed attempt at insurance fraud. Her broken timbers were left to rot in the tropical sun, eventually swallowed by the shifting sands of the Caribbean reef, leaving only her legend to endure. Today, the mystery of the Mary Celeste remains one of the most haunting chapters in maritime history, a story where science, history, and human tragedy collide. It is a stark reminder of the fragile boundary between survival and disaster on the open sea, where a single split-second decision, driven by the laws of chemistry and the instinct of human survival, can erase an entire group of people from the face of the earth. We may analyze the weather patterns of 1872, model the physics of pressure wave explosions, and study the mechanics of clogged bilge pumps, but the absolute truth of those final terrifying moments remains locked away. The Atlantic Ocean keeps its secrets well, buried deep beneath the rolling dark swells, where the names of Benjamin, Sarah, and little Sophia Briggs are written only in the wind, and the ghost of the Mary Celeste continues to sail forever in the quiet, empty spaces of our imagination.